I stood completely alone in the freezing rain to bury the woman who saved my life. While I watched her casket sink into the mud, my own mother called to tell me my grief was a trivial inconvenience. I swallowed that insult, biting my tongue until the blood tasted like copper. I let them believe they had crushed me. I let them think I was nothing without their money, but they had no idea that the will my wife left behind was about to cost them their entire $60 million empire. The November rain did not just fall. It felt like it was being thrown. It stung my cheeks and soaked completely through the thin fabric of my dark suit. I was 38 years old, but standing there watching the cemetery workers operate the mechanical winch, I felt like a helpless child. My wife Sarah was 36. Just 4 months ago, we were sitting on the floor of our tiny apartment eating takeout and talking about how we would finally pay off the business loan for my independent bookstore. Then came the cough that would not go away. Then the scans. Then the aggressive, merciless illness that stripped the color from her cheeks and the life from her lungs. Now she was inside a simple pine casket wrapped in the cold earth, and I was the only person standing by her grave. My family did not send flowers. They did not send a card. My father, Richard, and my mother, Beatrice, lived less than 40 miles away in a gated community that looked like a fortress. My older brother, Clayton, worked in a glass high-rise downtown as a corporate acquisitions attorney, securing deals that moved more money in an hour than I would see in a lifetime. None of them showed up. Sarah had spent her entire life working at a local women's shelter. She spent her days finding beds for broken people and her nights helping me keep my failing bookstore afloat. To my family, she was a nobody. She did not have a pedigree. She did not have a massive financial portfolio. Therefore, she did not exist. The mechanical gears of the lowering device squeaked against the heavy rain. I stared down into the dark rectangular hole, feeling a piece of my own soul being buried with her. That was when my phone started vibrating in my jacket pocket. I pulled the device out with numb fingers. The screen lit up through the raindrops. It was my mother. For a brief, foolish second, a wave of hope washed over me. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the reality of the situation had finally hit her. I thought my mother was calling to say she was sorry that she was on her way, that no man should have to bury his wife completely alone. I slid my thumb across the screen and held the phone to my cold ear. I did not even get the chance to say hello. "Julian, you need to turn your phone off and stop sending Clayton these depressing text messages," my mother said. Her voice was crisp, annoyed, and completely devoid of warmth. I could hear the faint sound of classical music playing in the background along with the clinking of a porcelain teacup. She was sitting in her luxury condo, irritated by my existence. I stood frozen. The rain dripped down my nose. I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully tight. "Mom, I am at the cemetery. They are lowering her into the ground right now." "Yes, we are perfectly aware of your schedule," Beatrice replied, her tone sharpening. "But Clayton is in the middle of closing a $60 million commercial zoning deal for your father. This is the biggest merger in the history of Hayes Global. We have investors flying in from Chicago. Clayton is pacing the floor because you keep texting him about funeral arrangements and hospital bills. We cannot pause our lives for this trivial inconvenience." The words hit me harder than a physical blow. Trivial. Inconvenience. My wife was dead. The woman I loved more than breathing was gone, and to my own mother it was an inconvenience. "She was my wife," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking against the wind. "She was a shelter worker, Julian." My mother fired back, completely unbothered. "She had no assets. She had no standing. We told you 10 years ago that marrying her was a financial mistake. Now you are drowning in medical debt because you refused to listen to your father. Have the service put her in the ground and move on. Do not contact your brother again until this merger is signed. You are acting like a child." The anger that ignited inside my chest was sudden and violent. It burned through the numbing cold. It burned through the grief. This was the family that had raised me. This was the family that measured human worth entirely by bank balances and tax brackets. My mind flashed back to a decade ago. I was 28 years old and trapped in a severe clinical depression. I had failed out of the corporate training program my father had forced me into. I could not handle the ruthless, cutthroat environment of his real estate firm. When I walked away to open a small bookstore, my father cut me off financially. My mother stopped calling. Clayton told me I was a pathetic embarrassment to the family name. I had hit rock bottom. I was ready to end my own life. It was Sarah who found me. She walked into my struggling bookstore one rainy Tuesday looking for a second-hand copy of a poetry book. She saw the heavy, dark emptiness in my eyes that my own family had ignored. She stayed and talked to me for 3 hours. She did not care that my bank account was overdrawn. She did not care that I drove a beat-up sedan or that my clothes were worn. She pulled me out of the darkness piece by piece, day by day. She gave me a reason to wake up. She literally saved my life. And now the people who had abandoned me were calling her death a trivial inconvenience. I gripped the phone so hard the plastic casing creaked. I looked down at the wooden casket resting at the bottom of the grave. I thought about Sarah's gentle smile and her endless capacity for forgiveness. But in that moment, I had no forgiveness left to give. "Listen to me very carefully," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It dropped into a low, steady register that I had never used before. Sarah was worth 100 of you. She had more grace in her little finger than this entire family has in its entire history. You care about your $60 million deal. You care about your zoning laws and your investors, but you do not care about your son. "Julian, do not use that tone with me," Beatrice snapped. "You are being dramatic just to get attention as always." "I am not being dramatic," I replied, the cold rain washing down my face. "I am making a promise. You and Dad and Clayton are dead to me. Do not call me again. Do not look for me. If I see any of you on the street, I will walk right past you. You have no son. Julian, if you hang up this phone, your father will hear about it. You know what he does to people who cross him." "Tell him to go to hell," I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end button. The screen went black. I stood there in the mud, breathing heavily, the rain masking the tears that finally spilled over my freezing cheeks. I turned my phone completely off and shoved it deep into my pocket. I stayed at the cemetery for another hour, standing in silence until the workers had filled the grave with dark, wet earth. I did not have an umbrella. I did not have a coat. I just stood there and let the storm wash over me until there was nothing left but a cold, hard resolve. When I finally walked back to my car, my legs felt like lead. My Honda Civic was 15 years old, the heater barely worked, and the brake pads squeaked every time I slowed down. I sat behind the steering wheel, shivering uncontrollably, staring out through the foggy windshield. I had no idea how I was going to survive the next week, let alone the rest of my life. The medical bills from Sarah's cancer treatments had been astronomical. Even with our basic insurance, the out-of-pocket costs for the experimental therapies and the intensive care unit had drained everything we had. I had emptied our joint savings account. I had maxed out 4 different credit cards. I had even taken money out of the bookstore's operational fund just to keep her comfortable during her final weeks. I had chosen her over the business, over my credit score, over my own future, and I would make that same choice 1,000 times over. But the reality of that choice was waiting for me when I drove back to my apartment building. It was a small, crumbling brick building on the industrial side of the city. The hallway smelled like old cabbage and damp carpet. As I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, my wet shoes squelching against the floorboards, all I wanted to do was crawl into our bed and smell Sarah's perfume on her pillow. I wanted to pull the blankets over my head and pretend none of this was happening. But as I turned the corner and looked down the dim hallway, my heart stopped completely. There was a bright yellow piece of paper taped to the center of my front door. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I walked slowly toward the door, my breathing shallow. I already knew what it was, but my brain refused to process the reality. I reached out with a trembling hand and peeled the wet tape away from the wood. It was a formal notice of eviction from the county sheriff. I stared at the black bold letters printed across the top of the page. Notice to vacate. Failure to pay rent. 72 hours to surrender the premises. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was freezing. The power had been shut off that morning. I walked into the small kitchen and looked at the stack of mail sitting on the cheap laminate counter. It was a mountain of final notices. The hospital collections department, the electric company, the credit card companies. They were all demanding money that simply did not exist. I dropped the yellow eviction notice onto the counter and leaned heavily against the sink. I looked around the room. Sarah's coffee mug was still sitting by the sink. Her winter coat was still hanging over the back of the dining chair. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It pressed against my eardrums until it physically hurt. I had absolutely nothing left. My wife was gone. My family had discarded me like trash. My business was failing, and in exactly 3 days I would be homeless. The hospital bills had wiped me out completely, leaving me an empty shell of a man standing in a dark, freezing kitchen. I sank to the floor, my wetsuit clinging to my skin, and pulled my knees to my chest. I sat there in the dark and let the weight of the entire world crush me. I was completely broken. I believed I had hit the absolute bottom. I believed my mother was right. I was a failure. I was a nobody, but I was wrong. The nightmare had not even fully begun, because the very next morning the real punishment for cutting off my family would arrive at my doorstep. And the tiny, meaningless envelope waiting for me at the bottom of this despair was going to trigger a war that none of us were prepared for. I slept on the floor of my bookstore that night. I could not bring myself to go back to my freezing apartment. I could not face that bright yellow eviction notice taped to my front door mocking my failure. The bookstore was the only true sanctuary I had left in the world. Sarah and I had built this place from the bare floorboards up. Every wooden shelf, every hand-painted sign, every carefully arranged display was a testament to the life we had scraped together. When I closed my eyes in the dark, I could still hear the faint echo of her laughter bouncing off the brick walls. I could still smell the vanilla and cedar scent she always wore mixed with the comforting aroma of old paper and roasted coffee. But the morning sun brought no comfort. It only illuminated the dust settling over my ruined life. I dragged myself up from the floor, my joints aching from the hard wood and the freezing dampness of my clothes from the cemetery. I walked over to the front counter and stared blankly out the large glass window at the street outside. The city was waking up, people rushing to work with their coffees, completely unaware that my entire universe had just been buried in the mud the day before. I had no money for breakfast. I had no money to turn the electricity back on at my apartment. My business bank account was practically empty, drained by the endless tide of co-pays, experimental medications, and emergency room fees that insurance refused to cover. I had sacrificed everything to buy Sarah just a few more weeks of life. I did not regret spending a single dime, but the harsh reality of my financial collapse was currently staring me right in the face. Before I could even figure out how to open the cash register, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb directly in front of my shop. My stomach instantly twisted into a hard, cold knot. I recognized the vehicle immediately. The heavy glass door of my shop swung open, the brass bell ringing with a cheerful chime that felt entirely out of place. It was my brother, Clayton. He stepped into my bookstore looking like he had just walked out of a luxury financial magazine. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that cost more than I made in 3 months. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his hair was perfectly swept back. He looked around my shop with a deeply ingrained expression of disgust, as if the mere presence of dusty books and worn wooden floors might somehow contaminate him. He did not look like a man whose sister-in-law had just been buried 24 hours ago. He looked like a corporate predator evaluating a distressed asset. I stood behind the counter, my hands gripping the edge of the wood so tightly my knuckles turned white. I braced myself for whatever fresh cruelty my family had decided to throw at me today. "You look terrible, Julian," Clayton said. His voice smooth, calculated, and devoid of any human empathy. He did not ask how the funeral went. He did not ask how I was holding up. He just stepped forward and placed a thick legal leather folder on my counter. "What do you want, Clayton?" I asked. My voice was gravelly and raw from crying the night before. "I told Mom yesterday that we are done. I told her not to contact me." Clayton let out a short, dismissive laugh. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned casually against my counter, looking at me with the same condescending pity he had used since we were children. "You think you can just throw a temper tantrum, insult our mother, and walk away clean?" Clayton asked, shaking his head. "You really do live in a fantasy world, Julian. You always have. You play the tragic victim, the poor, starving artist surrounded by his books. But you seem to have forgotten who actually owns the stage you are standing on." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Get out of my shop." "It is not your shop," Clayton replied instantly. His eyes turned ice cold. He opened the leather folder and slid a dense legal document across the glass display case toward me. I looked down at the paper. At the very top, printed in bold corporate letterhead, was the logo for Hayes Global, our father's commercial real estate firm. I recognized the document. It was the commercial lease agreement for the bookstore. Years ago, when I first tried to secure this location, the landlord required a high net worth guarantor. I was fresh out of my depression, completely broke and desperate. My father, Richard, had stepped in to co-sign the master lease. He did not do it out of love. He did it so he could hold a leash around my neck, constantly reminding me that my independence was just an illusion he funded. I had paid the rent myself every single month for 7 years, but his name remained on the master deed as the primary financial guarantor. "Dad was highly offended by your little outburst on the phone yesterday." Clayton continued, his tone perfectly measured and lethal. "He was in the middle of closing a $60 million deal, and you decided to throw a hysterical fit because Mom told you the truth about your situation." "The truth?" I practically spat the words at him. "My wife died, Clayton. I buried her alone in the freezing rain while you and Dad were popping champagne over commercial zoning rights. Do not come in here and lecture me about the truth." "The truth," Julian, Clayton said, cutting me off, "is that you are a financial liability. You have zero liquid capital. Your credit is destroyed. We ran a quiet background check on you this morning. We know about the eviction notice at your apartment. We know you maxed out your business credit lines to pay hospital bills for a woman who was already terminal. You made a bad investment and now the bill is due." I felt the blood drain from my face. They had actually run a financial background check on me while I was at the cemetery. The sheer calculated psychopathy of my own flesh and blood left me speechless. "Because you are clearly insolvent, and because you decided to bite the hand that feeds you, Dad is invoking the penalty clause on page 14 of the master lease agreement," Clayton said. He tapped a manicured finger against the document. "As the primary guarantor, he has the right to withdraw his financial backing if the sublessee proves a risk of default. He is pulling the lease, Julian." The room started to spin. The air in the bookstore suddenly felt incredibly thin. "He cannot do that," I stammered, my panic rising. "I have never missed a rent payment on this space. Never. I have always paid on time. This store is the only thing I have left to generate income." "You have not missed a payment yet," Clayton corrected, his voice dripping with superiority. "But with your apartment gone and your accounts empty, it is a mathematical certainty that you will default by the end of the quarter. Dad is not going to let your pathetic financial collapse damage his corporate credit rating. The lease is terminated effective immediately. The landlord has already been notified and legally compensated for the early breach." I stared at my brother, fully realizing the monster standing in front of me. They were not just cutting me off. They were actively dismantling the only lifeline I had left. They were putting a gun to the head of my business and pulling the trigger just to punish me for showing grief. "You are shutting down my store," I whispered, the devastating reality crashing down on my shoulders. "You are throwing me out into the street. Your own brother." Clayton did not flinch. He did not show a single ounce of remorse. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and set it on top of the document. "You did this to yourself, Julian," Clayton said coldly. "We tried to mold you into someone respectable. Dad gave you every opportunity to be part of the family empire, but you chose weakness. You chose a woman who had absolutely nothing to offer you. You chose a nobody, and now you are a nobody. Dad wants the keys to the shop by Friday." He did not wait for my response. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. The brass bell chimed brightly as the door shut behind him. I watched through the glass as he climbed into the back of his waiting town car and drove away, leaving me standing in the ruins of my life. I was completely ruined. I gripped the edges of the counter until my hands went numb. I had no wife to hold me. I had no family to turn to. I had no home to sleep in tonight, and by Friday I would have no business. My father and my brother had methodically stripped away every single pillar of my existence in less than 24 hours. The rest of the morning passed in a suffocating blur. I did not bother flipping the open sign on the front door. There was no point. I walked slowly through the aisles of the bookstore, running my fingertips over the spines of the novels Sarah had organized just a few months ago. I found a stack of bookmarks she had hand-painted with watercolors sitting near the register. I picked one up, my chest heaving as the physical pain of losing her tore through me all over again. I pulled a few cardboard boxes from the back storage room and started the agonizing process of packing up my life. I had no idea where I was going to take these books. I had no idea where I was going to sleep on Friday night. I was functioning on pure mechanical shock. Every time I placed a book into a box, Clayton's voice echoed in my head. "You chose a nobody, and now you are a nobody." They had won. The vultures had circled my weakness and picked my bones clean. I felt a deep, overwhelming urge to just lie down on the floor and never get back up. It was mid-afternoon when I heard a sharp knock on the front glass door. I looked up from a half-filled box of poetry books. Standing outside in the gray daylight was a postal worker holding a digital scanner and a thick, rigid envelope. I wiped the dust and tears from my face, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. "Julian Hayes," the postal worker asked, looking down at his device. "Yes," I answered, my voice hoarse. "Certified mail. I need a signature right here," he said, handing me the scanner and a plastic stylus. I scrawled a messy signature across the screen. The worker handed me the thick envelope, tipped his hat, and walked back down the street. I stood in the doorway, staring down at the envelope in my hands. The return address was printed in sharp, traditional black ink. It was from a law firm I had never heard of. It was located in an older, historic district of the city, far away from the sleek glass towers where my brother practiced corporate law. My heart skipped a beat as my eyes moved to the subject line typed boldly across the front of the heavy paper. "Regarding the last will and testament of Sarah Hawthorne Hayes." I stared at her name. Sarah had nothing. She worked at a women's shelter for minimum wage. We rented our apartment. We shared a single ancient car. We had to scrape together spare change just to buy groceries at the end of the month. She had absolutely no assets to her name. Why on earth was a probate attorney sending me certified legal documents regarding a will I did not even know existed? I walked slowly back to the front counter, my hands shaking slightly as I slid my thumb under the heavy paper flap of the envelope. I did not know it at that moment, standing in my dying bookstore, with absolutely nothing left to my name, but the contents of this letter were about to change the trajectory of my entire life. The family that had just destroyed me believed they held all the power. They believed I was a helpless victim who would just roll over and disappear. But the woman they called a nobody had left behind a secret, and that secret was about to give me the exact weapon I needed to tear their billion-dollar empire straight to the ground. The letter I received told me to present myself at a law office on the outskirts of the city. The address led me to a decaying strip mall in a neighborhood my brother would not even drive through with his windows rolled up. The rain from the previous days had left deep, muddy puddles in the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I walked up a flight of stairs that smelled strongly of damp wood and stale coffee. I was absolutely exhausted. I had spent the night sleeping on the hard wooden floor of my bookstore, a business that was legally being ripped from my hands by my own father. I was starving, freezing, and running entirely on adrenaline and grief. When I pushed open the frosted glass door of the office, a brass bell chimed weakly. The waiting room was tiny. There was no receptionist, just a solitary older man sitting behind a heavily cluttered desk. He wore a faded tweed suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up at me, his eyes gentle and deeply tired. He introduced himself as Thomas Abernathy, an attorney at law. He offered me a seat in a worn leather chair that squeaked under my weight. I sat down, clutching the certified letter in my hands. I told him I did not understand why I was there. Sarah and I shared everything. We shared our bank accounts, which were currently completely overdrawn. We shared our leased apartment, which I was being actively evicted from. She worked at a women's shelter. We barely had enough money to cover our monthly grocery bills. The idea that she had a private probate attorney and a formal will seemed completely absurd. I asked him if there was some kind of cruel mistake. Mr. Abernathy folded his hands on his desk and looked at me with a steady, solemn expression. He told me there was no mistake. He said Sarah had retained his services several years ago for a very specific purpose. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. My heart pounded against my ribs. For a fleeting second, a desperate, irrational hope flared inside my chest. Maybe Sarah had a secret savings account. Maybe she had tucked away a few $1,000s for emergencies. Maybe there was enough money in that envelope to pay off my eviction notice and keep a roof over my head. Before Mr. Abernathy could break the red wax seal on the envelope, the door to the office flew open with a violent crash. The frosted glass rattled in its wooden frame. I turned around in my chair, my blood instantly turning to ice. Standing in the doorway was my brother Clayton. He was flanked by a massive man in a dark suit who looked like private corporate security. Clayton stepped into the cramped, dusty office, looking around with absolute revulsion. He brushed a speck of dust from the lapel of his tailored charcoal suit and locked his eyes directly on me. I stood up instantly. My fists clenched painfully at my sides. I demanded to know what he was doing here. I had told him and my parents never to contact me again. They had already taken my business. They had already ensured I would be completely homeless by Friday. I asked him if he had come to physically throw me out onto the street himself. Clayton ignored my questions completely. He did not even look at me as a human being. He walked straight toward Mr. Abernathy's desk, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase, and slammed them down over the scattered papers. Clayton announced that he was there representing Richard Hayes, my father, and the corporate entity of Hayes Global. He looked at Mr. Abernathy with the predatory glare of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Clayton stated clearly that my father was a primary creditor to my estate. Because my father had co-signed the master lease for my failing bookstore, and because I was currently in default of my personal financial obligations, my father had a legal right to claim any assets I inherited to cover my outstanding debts. I stared at my brother in pure disbelief. I asked him what assets he was possibly talking about. Sarah and I lived paycheck to paycheck. We drove a 15-year-old car. We had nothing. Clayton laughed a cold, dry laugh. He turned to me and crossed his arms over his chest. He said I really was a naive fool. He told me that people who work in high-risk environments like women's shelters, people who deal with volatile and dangerous individuals daily, almost always carry mandatory state-sponsored life insurance policies. He said his paralegals had done the math. He estimated that Sarah likely had a standard policy worth at least $250,000. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a massive wave of nausea wash over me. My family had not just come to ruin my business. They had tracked down the exact location of my dead wife's will reading because they wanted to steal her life insurance money. They wanted to take the exact funds that were meant to help a grieving widower survive and use them to pay off a fabricated corporate debt to my billionaire father. The sheer suffocating greed of my own blood relatives made me want to scream and tear the room apart. Clayton leaned heavily over the desk, invading Mr. Abernathy's space. He tapped his index finger aggressively against the sealed manila envelope. He demanded that the attorney open the will immediately and sign over the total sum of the life insurance payout directly to the Hayes Global corporate holding account. He threatened to tie the estate up in probate court for a decade if Mr. Abernathy refused to comply. He said my father would bury this tiny law firm in so much litigation that they would never see the light of day. I expected Mr. Abernathy to shrink back. I expected him to be thoroughly intimidated by a ruthless corporate lawyer from a massive firm. Instead, the older man calmly reached out, picked up Clayton's stack of legal demands, and dropped them directly into the metal trash can beside his desk. Clayton's face flushed bright red. He opened his mouth to shout, but Mr. Abernathy raised a single, steady hand. The older attorney looked my brother dead in the eye and spoke with absolute, unshakable authority. He told Clayton that his legal threats were entirely meaningless. He stated that he had reviewed Sarah's financial portfolio extensively before this meeting. He then turned to me, his voice softening slightly, but his words carrying a heavy final weight. Mr. Abernathy informed us both that Sarah had absolutely no life insurance policy. She had no retirement accounts. She had no hidden stock portfolios. Her bank balance at the exact time of her death was exactly $42.16. There was no $250,000 payout. There was no money for my father to steal. There was no money to save my bookstore. There was no money to stop my eviction. Clayton stared at the attorney, his jaw tight with extreme frustration. He demanded to know why we were even having a formal will reading if the woman died completely broke. He pointed aggressively at the desk and asked what could possibly be inside the sealed envelope. Mr. Abernathy picked up a silver letter opener. He sliced carefully through the thick paper. He reached inside and pulled out 2 items. He placed them gently onto the center of the wooden desk. The first item was a small, folded piece of thick cream-colored paper. The second item was a single rusted safety deposit box key. The metal was dark brown, heavily chipped, and completely unbranded. It looked like it belonged to a locker that had not been opened in 50 years. Mr. Abernathy pushed the items toward me. He said this was the entirety of Sarah's estate. This was all she had left behind for me in this world. My hands trembled violently as I reached out and picked up the folded piece of paper. I recognized her beautiful looping handwriting instantly. Seeing her ink on the page brought a fresh, agonizing wave of tears to my eyes. It felt like she was standing right next to me, whispering into my ear. I opened the note. It contained only 2 short sentences. To Julian, who loved me when I was nothing. Look beneath the soil. I read the words over and over again. My vision completely blurred. I traced my thumb over her written name. Look beneath the soil. It made absolutely no sense to me. I picked up the rusted key. It was heavy and extremely cold in my palm. There was a faint sequence of numbers stamped into the side of the metal, barely legible through the thick layer of rust. Suddenly, a loud, echoing laugh filled the small room. I looked up. Clayton was throwing his head back, laughing so hard he had to place a hand on the edge of the desk to steady himself. The sound was incredibly harsh, echoing off the bare walls of the cramped office. He looked at the rusted key in my hand, and then looked directly at my tear-stained face. He clapped his hands together slowly, openly mocking me. He said this was the most poetic and pathetic thing he had ever witnessed in his entire legal career. He told me that I had thrown away my family, my inheritance, and my entire future for a woman who left me a piece of literal garbage. He pointed at the key and said it was probably the key to a rusted-out storage unit filled with old clothes and broken, worthless furniture. Clayton walked right up to me, his expensive cologne masking the smell of the damp room. He leaned in close, his voice dropping into a cruel, satisfied whisper. He told me that my father was completely right about me all along. I was a magnet for failure. I attracted nothing but poverty and utter disappointment. He said I had chosen a nobody. I married a nobody, and now my grand inheritance was a piece of literal rust. He promised me that by Friday morning the locks on my bookstore would be changed by a private security firm. By Monday morning, the county sheriff would physically remove me from my apartment. He said he would personally make sure that not a single bank in the entire city would ever give me a personal loan. He looked down at the key in my hand one last time, let out a final disgusted scoff, and turned toward the door, He signaled to his security guard, and the two of them walked out of the office. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving me in total ringing silence. I stood there for a very long time. My chest felt completely hollow. The humiliation burned through my veins, hot and deeply toxic. My own brother had come here to strip the flesh off my bones, and when he found out there was no meat left to take, he had laughed directly in my face. Mr. Abernathy stood up and walked around his desk. He handed me a small business card with an address printed clearly on the back. He told me that the key belonged to a private vault at the First Fidelity Trust, a very old, very quiet bank located in the historic downtown district. He said the box had been secured under Sarah's name for over 10 years. He offered his condolences one last time and gently showed me to the door. I walked back down the stairs and out into the gray, freezing afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a heavy, bruising purple. I sat in my freezing car and stared at the rusted key sitting in the palm of my hand. Look beneath the soil. My rational brain told me Clayton was probably right. Sarah was a shelter worker. We lived on pennies. The box probably contained basic sentimental items, old photographs, maybe a few childhood keepsakes. Absolutely nothing that could pay a landlord, nothing that could stop my father from destroying my business. But the desperation clawing at my stomach was louder than any logic. I was facing immediate, terrifying homelessness. I had an eviction notice waiting on my kitchen counter. I needed rent money. I needed food. I needed a miracle. Even if the box contained a few silver coins or an old piece of jewelry I could pawn, it might buy me another week of basic survival. It might buy me just enough time to figure out how to fight back against my family. I inserted my own key into the ignition of my battered car. The engine sputtered and choked loudly before finally roaring to life. I gripped the steering wheel tight and pulled out of the muddy parking lot, merging onto the busy highway. I drove straight toward the historic district of the city. I was driving toward a dusty, decades-old bank holding onto a rusted piece of metal that my brother had called garbage. I was completely ruined, hoping against all odds for just a handful of cash. I had absolutely no idea that I was driving straight toward the weapon that would soon bring my family to their knees. The drive to the historic downtown district felt like moving through a dream. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving the pavement slick and reflective under the gray afternoon sky. I drove my battered car through neighborhoods that felt entirely alien to me. These were streets lined with massive oak trees, wrought iron street lamps, and buildings constructed of heavy stone and marble. It was the kind of money that did not need to shout. It was the kind of money that simply existed silent and immovable. I parked 3 blocks away from the address Mr. Abernathy had given me. I could not afford to pay for a parking garage, so I found a broken meter on a side street and prayed I would not get a ticket. I walked toward the First Fidelity Trust building with the rusted key burning a hole in my pocket. The bank looked like a Greek temple. Massive limestone pillars held up a towering facade. The heavy brass doors were polished to a mirror shine. As I pulled one open and stepped inside, the chaotic noise of the city street vanished completely. The interior of the bank was perfectly silent, carpeted in thick burgundy wool with dark mahogany teller stations. I caught my reflection in a mirrored pillar. I looked like a beggar. My suit was completely ruined from the rain at the cemetery. My shoes were caked with mud. I looked exactly like the failure my brother had just accused me of being. A security guard near the entrance watched me closely, his hand resting near his radio. I ignored him and walked straight to the main desk. An older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun looked up at me over her reading glasses. I placed the small business card from Mr. Abernathy and the rusted key onto the polished wood counter. I told her I needed to access a safety deposit box. My voice sounded harsh and out of place in the quiet room. The woman picked up the key and examined the numbers stamped into the side. She typed something into her computer terminal. Then she asked for my identification. I handed over my driver license. She looked at my face, looked at the screen, and then nodded slowly. She asked me to follow her. She stepped out from behind the counter and led me toward a heavy steel gate at the back of the lobby. We walked down a long, curving staircase that descended deep into the basement of the building. The air grew significantly colder with every step. We reached a massive circular vault door, easily 3 feet thick, which stood wide open. Beyond it was a room lined with thousands of small metal doors. She led me to a narrow aisle near the very back. She stopped in front of a box near the floor. She inserted a silver master key into the left lock. She gestured for me to insert my rusted key into the right lock. My hand was shaking so badly I dropped the key on the first try. It clattered loudly against the floor tiles. I picked it up, my face burning with embarrassment, and pushed it into the slot. We turned the keys at the exact same time. The internal mechanism let out a heavy metallic clank. The woman pulled the long metal drawer out of the wall. It was surprisingly large, much deeper than a standard box. She carried it to a small private viewing room just outside the vault. The room had a single wooden table, a brass reading lamp, and a heavy leather chair. She placed the box on the table, told me to take as much time as I needed, and softly closed the solid oak door behind her. I was completely alone. I stood over the metal box, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes and said a silent prayer. I prayed for a stack of $100 bills. I prayed for a small bag of gold coins. I prayed for absolutely anything that I could take to a pawn shop so I could pay my landlord and stop the eviction notice currently taped to my apartment door. I just needed enough cash to survive the week. I took a deep breath, reached out, and flipped the metal lid open. There was no cash. There were no coins. There was no jewelry. The box was filled to the brim with thick aged paper. A crushing wave of disappointment hit me so hard my knees actually buckled. I sank down into the leather chair staring at the contents of the box. My vision blurred. Clayton was right. My brother had laughed in my face and told me I was inheriting garbage, and he was absolutely right. Sarah had no money. I was going to be homeless by Monday. My bookstore was going to be seized by Friday. I rested my forehead against the edge of the mahogany table and let out a broken, exhausted sob. After several minutes of sitting in the quiet despair of that small room, I forced myself to sit up. I wiped my eyes and reached into the box. If this was all she had left me, I was at least going to look at it. I pulled out the largest item first. It was a heavy leather-bound folio tied together with a faded black ribbon. The leather was dry and cracking at the edges. I untied the ribbon and opened the cover. The pages inside were thick legal parchment. At the very top of the first page, printed in an elegant old-fashioned typeface, were the words, "The Hawthorne Ecological Trust." I frowned, tracing my finger over the letters. Hawthorne. I knew that name. Anyone who grew up in this city knew that name. The Hawthornes were one of the original founding families of the region. They were massive timber barons in the early 20th century. They had built their fortune by clearing thousands of acres of old-growth forests, turning wood into railroads, factories, and mansions. But the family line had supposedly died out decades ago. The last known heir had vanished from public records, and the remaining estate had been tied up in endless rumors and legal speculation. I moved the legal documents aside. Beneath them lay a smaller standard white envelope. My name was written across the front in Sarah's handwriting. I picked it up, my fingers trembling again. I broke the seal and pulled out 3 pages of lined notebook paper. The date at the top indicated she had written this exactly 5 years ago, right around the time my father had forced me to sign the master lease for my bookstore. I adjusted the brass lamp on the table and began to read. My dearest Julian, if you are sitting in a bank vault reading this, it means my illness finally won. It means I have left you alone in a world that has never been kind to you. For that I am more sorry than words can possibly express. There is a secret I have kept from you since the day we met in your bookstore. It was not a secret born of malice, but a secret born of self-preservation. My maiden name was not Smith. My real name is Sarah Elizabeth Hawthorne. I stopped reading and stared at the paper. My lungs refused to take in air. My wife, the woman who worked for minimum wage at a downtown women's shelter, the woman who clipped coupons so we could afford heating oil in the winter, was the final living heir to the Hawthorne timber dynasty. I forced my eyes back to the letter. I was born into a world of sickening wealth, Julian. The kind of wealth that destroys the human soul. My grandfather and my father were ruthless men. They believed that everything and everyone had a price tag. I grew up watching them destroy small businesses, tear apart communities, and pave over nature just to add another zero to their bank accounts. When my father passed away, I became the sole beneficiary of the remaining Hawthorne estate. But I did not want their blood money. I saw what greed did to people. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for the legal title attached to my last name. So I legally placed the remainder of the family assets into an impenetrable private trust. I changed my surname. I walked away from the mansions and the luxury cars, and I took a job helping the very people my family had spent a century stepping on. Then I met you. You were so broken when I found you in that bookstore. Your own father had crushed your spirit because you refused to become a corporate predator like him. You chose to surround yourself with books and art and quiet beauty. I knew instantly that your heart was pure. I knew that you were the exact opposite of the men who raised me and the men who raised you. I watched you sacrifice your own financial stability to keep me healthy. I watched you empty your business accounts to pay for my chemotherapy. You loved me when I was nothing. You proved that you value human life over money. That is why I am leaving the Hawthorne Ecological Trust entirely in your hands. You are the only person on this earth I trust to protect it. I set the letter down on the desk. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely control them. Sarah was a millionaire. She had been a millionaire this entire time. We had lived in near poverty, eating cheap noodles and shivering in a drafty apartment while she held the keys to a historical fortune. I reached back into the metal box and pulled out the legal deeds. I flipped frantically through the heavy parchment pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. I was looking for bank account numbers. I was looking for stock portfolios. I was looking for the cash that was going to save my life. But as I read through the trust stipulations, a cold, heavy feeling began to settle into the pit of my stomach. The Hawthorne Ecological Trust did not contain cash. The trust was a real estate holding vehicle. According to the deed in my hands, Sarah had placed exactly 400 acres of prime undeveloped forest land into the trust. The land was located right on the edge of the city limits. It was the very last piece of virgin property in the entire metropolitan area that had not been paved over by commercial developers. I stared at the property map attached to the deed. 400 acres of prime real estate. I was suddenly holding a piece of paper that was easily worth tens of millions of dollars. The rush of absolute victory was intoxicating. Clayton had laughed at me. My father had thrown me out. But I was sitting here holding the deed to the most valuable piece of undeveloped land in the county. I could sell it tomorrow. I could pay off my bookstore. I could buy an actual house. I could walk into my father's corporate office and throw the cash directly in his face. But then I turned to the next page of the trust document, and my entire world collapsed all over again. The document was titled Declaration of Irrevocable Ecological Restrictions. I read the paragraphs slowly, my heart sinking with every single word. When Sarah created the trust, she did not just park the land in a holding company, she legally restricted it. The trust charter explicitly stated that the 400 acres could never be commercially developed. It could never be logged. It could never be paved, subdivided, or sold to a corporate entity for profit. It was legally bound to remain untouched ecological land in perpetuity. I flipped the page, my panic rising. Because the land could not be developed, it generated absolutely zero income. There was no timber revenue. There were no tenant leases. The land was a financial ghost, but it was still located inside the county limits. And the county did not care if the land was a nature preserve. The county only cared about property taxes. I reached the very bottom of the box and pulled out a manila folder with the county tax assessor seal stamped on the front. I opened the folder. Inside was a formal property tax bill addressed to the executor of the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. The total amount due was printed in bold red ink. $50,000. I stared at the number. The zeros seemed to swim on the page. $50,000. And it was an annual tax. The document clearly stated that the next payment was due in exactly 30 days. If the taxes were not paid in full, the county would place a lien on the property, seize the 400 acres and sell it at public auction to the highest bidder to recoup the lost revenue. The air in the private viewing room vanished. I could not breathe. I looked down at the rusted key sitting on the mahogany table. It was not a key to a treasure chest. It was a key to a financial bear trap. My dead wife had not left me a fortune. She had left me a crushing, insurmountable debt. I currently had $42 in my checking account. I was being evicted from my apartment tomorrow. My father was legally seizing my bookstore on Friday. I could barely afford to put gas in my car. And now, as the sole legal executor of this trust, I was personally responsible for a $50,000 tax bill that was due in 4 weeks. If I did not pay it, the land would be seized by the government. The only legacy Sarah had left behind, the only piece of nature she had tried so desperately to protect from corporate greed, would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. It felt like a cruel, twisted joke. Clayton's mocking laughter echoed in the back of my mind. You chose a nobody, and now you are a nobody. I buried my face in my hands. The heavy, dark despair settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was completely trapped. I had no money, no leverage, and no way out. I sat in the silent bank vault, staring at the multi-million-dollar piece of land that was going to serve as the final nail in my coffin. I thought this was the end. I thought my family had won. But as I sat there staring at the property map, I had absolutely no idea that my parents were already hunting for this exact piece of land. I did not know that the 400 acres of restricted forest I now owned was the only thing standing between my father's corporate empire and total financial ruin. I sat in the driver's seat of my battered car for a very long time after I left the bank. The engine was turned off and the cold air seeped through the thin glass of the windows, but I could not feel the temperature. I could only feel the crushing weight of the piece of paper resting on my lap. The county property tax bill glared up at me with that bold red ink. $50,000. It was a sum of money so completely out of my reach that it might as well have been 50 million. In less than 24 hours, I had buried my wife, had my family openly severe, all ties with me received an eviction notice, and been informed that my father was legally stealing my bookstore. Now, as the newly appointed executor of the Hawthorne Ecological Trust, I was personally responsible for a massive tax debt on 400 acres of restricted, unusable forest land. My chest heaving with panic, I stared through the foggy windshield at the gray city skyline. I felt like a rat caught in a steel trap. My mind raced through every possible scenario. I could not sell the land because the trust legally forbade commercial development. I could not borrow against the land because I had completely destroyed my personal credit to pay for Sarah's cancer treatments. If I did not pay the county in exactly 30 days, they would place a tax lien on the property, seize the 400 acres, and auction it off to corporate developers. The very thing Sarah had spent her entire life trying to prevent would happen the second she was gone, all because I was a financial failure. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to understand why this specific piece of land was so important and why the county was assessing it at such an astronomical tax rate if it was supposedly unusable swampland. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine choked and rattled before finally turning over. I drove straight away from the historic district and headed toward the Municipal Records building downtown. I did not care that my suit was still damp and wrinkled from the cemetery. I did not care that I looked like a desperate madman. I was fighting for my absolute survival. The county clerk office was a sterile, brightly lit room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. I walked up to the public access terminals, pulled the property deed from my pocket, and typed the 12-digit parcel number into the municipal zoning database. The screen flickered, loading the public records for the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of text. The land was zoned as a protected green space. But right below the current zoning status, a massive block of bright red text caught my attention. there was an active, highly aggressive petition filed with the City Planning Commission to rezone the entire 400 acres. I clicked on the petition link. The terminal opened a digital file containing hundreds of pages of legal requests, environmental impact waivers, and corporate lobbying documents. Someone with incredibly deep pockets was spending an absolute fortune trying to force the city to strip the ecological protections off Sarah's land. I scrolled down to the architectural attachments. My jaw tightened as a series of high-resolution blueprints and digital renderings filled the screen. They were not just trying to build a few houses. The petition outlined a billion-dollar luxury commercial hub. The renderings showed sprawling high-end shopping pavilions, massive glass corporate towers, a luxury hotel, and rows of ultra-premium condominiums built right over the untouched forest. The project was absolutely colossal. It was the kind of mega-development that redefined an entire city and generated billions of dollars in revenue for whatever corporate entity owned the dirt underneath it. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the applicant name listed at the top of the zoning petition. It was registered to a holding company called Apex Horizon Development. I had never heard of them. It sounded like a generic corporate shell company designed to hide the true identity of the developers. I opened a new tab on the public terminal and accessed the state business registry. I typed in Apex Horizon Development. I pulled up their articles of incorporation and scrolled down to the registered agents and executive officers. The screen loaded the names. I stopped breathing. The air in the municipal building completely vanished from my lungs. Listed as the lead legal counsel and primary registered agent for the shell company was Clayton Hayes, my brother. Listed as the primary shareholder and parent organization of the shell company was Hayes Global, my father's company. I stared at the glowing monitor, my vision narrowing until all I could see was my family's name stamped across the digital documents. The puzzle pieces suddenly violently snapped together in my mind. I heard my mother's voice echoing in my head from the phone call at the cemetery. Julian, we are closing a $60 million commercial zoning deal today. We cannot pause our lives for this trivial inconvenience. She was just a shelter worker. It was this deal. This was the exact deal my family was popping champagne over while I stood in the mud burying my wife. They were finalizing the massive commercial zoning permits for a billion-dollar luxury hub, completely confident that they could pressure the city into breaking the ecological trust. A wave of profound, sickening realization washed over me. I gripped the edges of the plastic keyboard, my knuckles turning white. My parents had not just hated Sarah because she was poor. For the past 5 years, my father had been obsessed with this specific piece of land. 5 years ago was when he suddenly began aggressively micromanaging my life, forcing me to sign the master lease for the bookstore, trying to drag me back into the family business so he could monitor my every move. It was the exact same time Sarah had finalized the Hawthorne Ecological Trust documents with her attorney. Hayes Global had been hunting for the anonymous owner of the Hawthorne estate for 5 years. My father had deployed teams of corporate lawyers, private investigators, and city lobbyists to figure out who was holding the deed to the last pristine plot of land in the metropolitan area. They wanted it desperately. They needed it to build their crown jewel development. And for 5 years, they had sat across the Thanksgiving dinner table from my wife, rolling their eyes at her thrift store dresses and mocking her job at the women's shelter. They called her a nobody. They called her a parasite. My mother refused to even learn her last name before we got married. They had spent half a decade hunting a ghost, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting quietly in their dining room, enduring their endless cruelty and elitist insults, was the sole heir to the very empire they were trying to conquer. Sarah held the absolute master key to my father's entire corporate future, and she never said a single word. She let them believe they were the kings of the world, while she quietly held their fate in the palm of her hand. A harsh, jagged laugh escaped my throat. A few people in the clerk office turned to look at me, but I did not care. The sheer magnificent irony of the situation was intoxicating. But Sarah was smart. She knew my father was a predator. If she had revealed her true identity, my father would have used every dirty legal trick in his arsenal to destroy the trust and steal the land from her. He would have used his leverage over my bookstore to blackmail her into signing away the deed. She stayed quiet to protect the forest, but more importantly, she stayed quiet to protect me. She knew that the moment her wealth was revealed, my family would tear us apart like wolves fighting over a carcass. I looked back at the computer screen. The picture was becoming clearer, but something still did not make sense. Hayes Global was a massive company, but securing zoning permits before actually owning the land was incredibly risky. My father was a calculating man. He would not spend tens of millions of dollars on architectural plans, city bribes, and legal fees unless he had a guarantee that he could acquire the land. I asked myself how my father planned to take ownership of a property that was locked in an irrevocable trust. I thought about the $50,000 tax bill sitting in my pocket. I thought about how Clayton had shown up at my bookstore at the crack of dawn to pull my lease and ensure I would be totally bankrupt by Friday. The realization hit me like a freight train. My father did not know Sarah was the Hawthorne heir, but his lawyers had clearly discovered that the trust was legally required to pay property taxes. My father knew that whoever controlled the trust was likely hiding behind a wall of privacy. But he also knew that if he could convince the city to hike the property appraisal value of the surrounding commercial area, the tax burden on the forest would skyrocket. My father had intentionally lobbied the city to raise the property taxes to $50,000 a year, deliberately trying to bleed the anonymous trust dry. He was trying to force a tax default. He knew that the second the taxes went unpaid, the county would seize the land and auction it off, and Hayes Global would be waiting at the courthouse steps with a blank check ready to buy the 400 acres for pennies on the dollar. It was a brilliant, ruthless corporate chokehold, and they had engineered the entire trap without ever realizing that I, their own son, was the one standing on the trap door. My brother shutting down my bookstore was not just a punishment for my behavior at the funeral. It was a calculated corporate execution. By cutting off my only source of income, Clayton was ensuring that I could not possibly pay any unexpected debts. He was making absolutely certain that I was financially paralyzed. They thought they were just punishing a disobedient son. They had absolutely no idea they were actively ensuring the default of the exact trust they were trying to acquire. I scrolled further down into the public filings. I needed to know how far along Hayes Global was in this process. I searched for the financial disclosures attached to the zoning petition. Corporate mega-developments like this required massive amounts of upfront capital, and my father rarely used his own cash. I found a secondary document filed under the State Commerce Commission. It was a declaration of corporate financing for the Apex Horizon project. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the fine print of the commercial loan agreement. Hayes Global had not secured a traditional bank mortgage for this project. They had taken out a mezzanine loan. I knew enough about corporate real estate from my miserable years working under my father to know exactly what a mezzanine loan was. It was a high-risk astronomical interest loan used by aggressive developers to bridge the gap between their available cash and a massive acquisition. But mezzanine loans were incredibly dangerous. They were not just secured by the property being purchased. They were secured by the equity of the parent company itself. Hayes Global had borrowed $100 million from a ruthless private equity firm in Chicago to fund the lobbying, the blueprints, and the eventual auction purchase of the Hawthorne land. My father had literally bet his entire company on this single development. He had put up Hayes Global as the collateral. I looked at the maturity date of the loan printed clearly on the screen. The mezzanine loan was due in exactly 30 days. If Hayes Global did not acquire the Hawthorne land, break the ecological trust, and secure the final commercial zoning permits by the end of the month, the private equity firm in Chicago would call the loan due. Since my father had spent the money on lobbying and architectural fees rather than a tangible asset, he would not be able to pay it back. The equity firm would instantly seize Hayes Global. My father would lose his buildings. He would lose his company. He would face absolute total bankruptcy. I sat back in the hard plastic chair. The buzzing fluorescent lights of the county clerk office seemed to hum with a new vibrating energy. 30 days. The county tax bill for the trust was due in 30 days. My father's $100 million loan was due in 30 days. Our timelines were perfectly disastrously aligned. My family thought I was a pathetic, grieving loser. Clayton had looked me in the eye and told me I was a nobody who married a nobody. They thought they had backed me into a corner where my only option was to curl up and accept my fate as a homeless failure. They thought they had engineered the perfect corporate takeover. They did not realize they had just handed a loaded gun directly to the man they had spent 30 years abusing. If I did not pay the $50,000 tax bill, the county would seize the land, my father would buy it at auction, and his billion-dollar commercial hub would proceed exactly as planned. His empire would multiply. My brother would become a corporate legend, and the forest Sarah loved would be paved over in concrete and glass. But if I somehow found a way to hold on to that land, if I refused to sell, if I let the clock run out on their 30-day window, Hayes Global would default. My father would be financially annihilated. My brother would be legally ruined for taking out a mezzanine loan on unconfirmed property. Everything they valued, everything they had chosen over their own son would burn to the ground. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the rusted safety deposit box key. I stared at the chipped brown metal resting in my palm. It did not look like a curse anymore. It looked like a detonator. Sarah had not left me a tax burden. She had left me the ultimate instrument of justice. She had given me the exact tool required to avenge the decades of cruelty my family had inflicted upon both of us. I closed the browser on the public terminal and stood up. I folded the property tax bill carefully and slid it into my inside jacket pocket next to my wife's handwritten letter. The paralyzing despair that had choked me since the cemetery was completely gone. The cold, mechanical shock of my impending eviction had vanished. In its place was a sharp, burning clarity. I walked out of the municipal building and stepped back into the freezing afternoon air. I was still broke. I was still losing my apartment. I was still losing my bookstore. But for the first time in my entire life, I held the absolute power over the House of Hayes. My family was about to learn a very brutal lesson about what happens when you treat human beings like trivial inconveniences. I pulled out my phone, turned it back on, and prepared to set a trap they would never see coming. I sat on the cold floor of my freezing apartment, taping up a cardboard box filled with Sarah's clothes. My eviction was scheduled for tomorrow morning. The power had been completely shut off, leaving the rooms bathed in the bleak gray light of the November afternoon. My breath plumed in the freezing air with every exhale. To anyone looking through the window, I was a completely broken man packing up the pathetic remains of a failed life. But inside my jacket pocket, resting directly against my chest, was the formal property deed to the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. I now held the absolute power to destroy my father, my mother, and my brother. I just needed to figure out how to make them step into the trap. I did not have to wait long. News travels incredibly fast in municipal buildings when billions of dollars are on the line. A sharp, heavy knock on my apartment door broke the suffocating silence. I froze in place. I fully expected the county sheriff arriving early to physically remove me from the property. I slowly stood up my joints, aching from the hard floor, and walked to the front door. I looked through the scratched peephole. My blood instantly turned to absolute ice. Standing in the dimly lit, foul-smelling hallway was my father, Richard Hayes. Standing right next to him was my mother, Beatrice, and my brother, Clayton. They had not visited my apartment in over 8 years. My father wore a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than a year of my rent. My mother held a designer leather handbag tightly against her chest, looking at the peeling paint on my walls with undisguised disgust. Clayton stood behind them, checking his luxury wristwatch with a look of extreme impatience. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into the face of a completely defeated, grieving widower. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The sheer hypocrisy of the next few minutes almost made me physically sick. My mother, The woman who had called my wife a trivial inconvenience while I was literally standing in the rain at the cemetery let out a loud, theatrical gasp. She pushed past me into the apartment, reached out, and grabbed my shoulders. She pulled me into a highly uncomfortable, completely fake embrace. She smelled strongly of expensive floral perfume and cold calculation. She told me how incredibly worried they had been. She said my grief was tearing the family apart. I stood perfectly still, letting her play her twisted game. I did not hug her back. My father pushed his way into the apartment next. He stepped over the cardboard boxes and looked around the freezing, dark living room. He shook his head slowly, putting on a masterful mask of deep paternal concern. He told me it was a total tragedy that I was living in such squalor. He completely ignored the fact that he was the exact reason I was losing my bookstore and my income. He acted as though my financial ruin was just a natural disaster that he had tragically arrived too late to prevent. He pointed to a cheap folding chair and asked if we could sit down and have a serious conversation about my future. Clayton took control of the room. He did not bother to sit. He stood by the window, blocking out the remaining light, casting a long, dark shadow across the floor. He told me that his legal paralegals had been doing a routine public records check regarding my upcoming eviction. He claimed they accidentally stumbled across a county clerk filing connected to Sarah. Clayton shook his head, feigning a look of deep brotherly pity. He said he was incredibly sorry to inform me that Sarah had hidden a terrible financial burden from me. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He used his most persuasive, deeply sympathetic voice. It was the exact voice he used when he was about to steal a building from a desperate competitor. He told me that Sarah was the legal owner of a massive plot of unusable swampland on the edge of the county. He said the land was completely restricted by environmental laws. It could never be developed. It could never be logged. He told me it was a toxic asset that generated absolutely no money. Then, with perfect dramatic timing, he dropped the hammer. He told me that the county was assessing a $50,000 property tax bill on the land. I forced my eyes to widen in mock horror. I let my breathing grow shallow and panicked. I acted exactly like a man who had just been handed a financial death sentence. I stammered over my words. I asked my father how I could possibly pay that much money. I told him I was completely broke. I reminded him that I was being evicted tomorrow. I played the pathetic, helpless victim to absolute perfection. My father smiled. It was a warm, generous smile that completely hid the razor-sharp teeth underneath. He told me that family always protects family. He said he could not stand back and watch the county send his youngest son to jail for tax evasion. He reached into his cashmere coat and pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it and laid a legally binding purchase agreement on the small folding table between us. My father offered to buy the land from me. He told me the dirt was completely worthless to his corporate firm, but he was willing to take the financial hit purely as a favor to his grieving son. He offered me $200,000 in cash. He also promised to completely forgive the broken lease agreement on my bookstore. He said the $200,000 would give me a fresh start. It would pay off Sarah's hospital bills. It would allow me to find a nice, comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood. He framed the low-ball bribe as the ultimate act of paternal salvation. I stared down at the contract on the table. $200,000. They were offering me $200,000 for 400 acres of pristine real estate that was worth at least $40 million on the open commercial market. But it was infinitely worse than that. I already knew about the $100 million mezzanine loan my father had taken out from the Chicago equity firm. I knew that if my father did not acquire this exact piece of land in the next 30 days, his entire corporate empire would collapse into total bankruptcy. My father was not offering me a lifeline. He was trying to steal the parachute right off my back while actively pushing me out of an airplane. I reached out with a trembling hand and lightly touched the edge of the paper contract. Clayton immediately pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his pocket and held it out to me. He was practically vibrating with corporate greed. His eyes were wide, completely fixated on the signature line at the bottom of the page. They were so desperate. They needed this land so badly they could taste it, but they were doing everything in their power to make it look like they were doing me a massive charitable favor. I pulled my hand back slowly. I looked at the silver pen, then looked up at my father with tears deliberately welling in my eyes. I told him I was completely overwhelmed. I told him that my brain was not working right. I said I had just buried the absolute love of my life yesterday in the freezing rain, and I simply could not process any more legal documents. I begged him to just give me a few days to properly grieve. I promised him I would read the paperwork, but I just needed a moment to breathe and clear my head. Clayton snapped. His professional corporate mask slipped for a fraction of a second. He stepped forward aggressively, his voice raising in volume. He told me I was being a complete idiot. He said the county would seize the land by the end of the month, and I would get absolutely nothing. He demanded I sign the paper right then and there to save myself from total ruin. My father immediately raised his hand to silence Clayton. My father was a master manipulator of vulnerable people. He knew that pushing a broken man too hard might cause the man to run away entirely. My father stood up, buttoned his cashmere overcoat, and placed a highly comforting hand on my shoulder. He told me to take all the time I needed. He said there was no rush, even though I knew the clock on his mezzanine loan was loudly and violently ticking down to his total destruction. He told me to just call his personal cell phone by the end of the week. They turned in unison and walked toward the apartment door. I stood in the center of the dark living room watching them go. My mother opened the door and stepped out into the dim hallway first. My father followed closely behind her. Clayton was the last to leave. As he stepped over the threshold, he did not close the door completely. The old rusted hinges caught, leaving a narrow crack just wide enough for sound to travel freely. I stood perfectly still in the dark apartment and listened. Their expensive leather shoes echoed loudly on the cheap linoleum floor of the hallway. I heard my mother speak first. Her voice was sharp and filled with absolute unfiltered disdain. She asked my father if he really thought I would sign the valuable property over to them. She complained bitterly that my apartment smelled like disease and failure and said she needed to dry clean her clothes immediately. I heard my father laugh. It was a cold, deeply arrogant sound. He told my mother not to worry for a single second. He said I was completely pathetic and entirely gullible. He told her I was far too stupid to ever realize what the land was actually worth to their company. He said I would come crawling to his corporate office by Friday afternoon, begging for the $200,000. He bragged to his wife and his oldest son that he had just secured the final most crucial piece of his billion-dollar commercial luxury hub for absolute pennies. I heard their footsteps fade down the stairs, followed by the heavy echoing slam of the main building door. I was completely alone again in my freezing dark apartment. I walked over to the folding table and picked up the purchase agreement my father had left behind. I stared at the blank signature line. My family truly believed they had just successfully executed the greatest legal robbery of their entire lives. They fully believed I was a broken, weak man who would simply surrender my dead wife's legacy for a few meaningless scraps from their dining table. I folded the contract in half and smiled in the dark, empty room. They had absolutely no idea that I'd already hired Sarah's old probate attorney. They had no idea I was quietly preparing to drop a nuclear bomb on their corporate headquarters. The sound of my parents' footsteps faded down the stairwell, followed by the heavy metal clang of the main building door, shutting against the winter wind. I stood completely alone in the center of my dark, freezing apartment. The silence they left behind was thick and suffocating. I looked down at the cheap folding table in my living room. Resting on the scratched surface was the purchase agreement my father had just offered me. $200,000. He wanted me to sign over 400 acres of pristine real estate that was worth at least $40 million to his commercial development firm. He had smiled at me. He had put his hand on my shoulder and acted like a loving father throwing a life raft to a drowning son. He thought I was completely blind. He thought my grief had made me stupid. He had absolutely no idea that I had just spent the morning at the county clerk office. He did not know that I had already seen the public zoning petitions, or that I knew about his $100 million mezzanine loan. I knew he was facing total corporate bankruptcy in exactly 30 days if he did not acquire the Hawthorne land. I picked up the insulting contract, crumpled it into a tight ball, and threw it into the corner of the room. I did not need his fake charity. I needed answers. I walked over to the worn canvas duffel bag I had brought back from the bank vault. I unzipped the heavy brass teeth and pulled out the massive stack of legal deeds and trust documents Sarah had left behind. I spread the aged parchment papers across the cold linoleum floor of my apartment. I needed to understand every single clause, every restriction, and every loophole of the Hawthorne Ecological Trust before I made my next move against my family. I had to know exactly why Sarah had kept this a secret for our entire marriage. As I shifted a heavy stack of property surveys, my hand brushed against something thick and solid at the very bottom of the bag. It was wrapped in a piece of dark protective canvas. I pulled it out and unrolled the fabric. It was a heavy leather-bound journal. The dark brown cover was cracked and dry from decades of storage. The edges of the pages were yellowed with age. I opened the front cover, my hands shaking slightly in the cold air. The pages were filled with sharp, slanted block handwriting. It was written in black fountain pen ink. I did not recognize the writing at first. It certainly did not belong to my wife. I turned to the first page. A name was written boldly across the top margin. William Hawthorne. It was Sarah's father. I sat down on the floor, crossing my legs, and brought the journal closer to the dim light filtering through my living room window. I began to read. I read for hours as the afternoon sun faded into a bleak winter twilight. What I found inside those pages was a story of such calculated, ruthless cruelty that it made my blood run entirely cold. William Hawthorne was not like the men who had built his family fortune. His grandfather and his father had been ruthless timber barons. They had stripped the land bare, bullied local politicians, and built a massive financial empire on the back of environmental destruction. But William was a quiet, gentle man. The diary detailed his profound guilt over his family legacy. When he inherited the remaining Hawthorne estate 25 years ago, he decided to stop the logging operations completely. He wanted to take the final 400 acres of virgin forest his family owned and lock it away in an irrevocable ecological trust, preserving the land forever as a sanctuary. But doing so required a massive amount of liquid capital. William needed to pay off the outstanding corporate debts left behind by his father, clear the commercial liens on the heavy logging machinery, and finalize the massive legal fees required to establish the trust. He went to the local banks for a commercial loan, but his family business was in a transitional phase and the traditional banks considered him a high-risk borrower. That was when a charismatic, aggressive commercial real estate developer stepped into William Hawthorne's life and offered him a private bridge loan. The developer's name was Richard Hayes, my father. I stopped reading. My lungs felt like they had been filled with ice water. I stared at my father's name written in the diary, the ink fading into the yellow paper. A wave of profound nausea hit my stomach. My father had known my wife's family. He had been involved with them 2 decades before I ever met Sarah. I forced myself to keep reading. The diary detailed exactly how the trap was set. My father offered William a highly predatory commercial loan. The terms were deliberately incredibly complex. My father structured the loan with a hidden acceleration clause and a brutal balloon payment. But William was desperate to save the forest and secure his daughter's future, so he signed the contract. As soon as the ink was dry, my father went to work. He did not want the loan to be repaid. He wanted the Hawthorne land. My father used his extensive political connections at the city council to block William from selling off the remaining logging equipment. He filed frivolous lawsuits to freeze William's bank accounts. He systematically and deliberately strangled William's cash flow, knowing that William would not be able to make the massive balloon payment when it came due. My father was using the exact same playbook on William Hawthorne 20 years ago that he was using on me right now. He had co-signed my bookstore lease just to pull the funding the second I showed weakness. He cuts off your air supply, backs you into a corner, and waits for you to suffocate so he can steal whatever you have left. The diary entries grew darker and more frantic as the months passed. William wrote about his failing health. He wrote about the crushing, agonizing stress of watching his family legacy be torn apart by a corporate vulture. He wrote about the severe chest pains that kept him awake at night as the deadline for the balloon payment rapidly approached. My father was calling William's house daily, threatening to seize the land, threatening to leave Sarah completely penniless on the street. The final entry in the journal was not written by William. It was written in the soft, careful handwriting that I recognized instantly. It was Sarah. She had been just 16 years old. She wrote about the night her father collapsed on the floor of their home office. She wrote about riding in the back of the ambulance holding his hand as his heart simply gave out under the weight of the massive, engineered financial stress. My father had literally harassed and terrorized William Hawthorne into a fatal heart attack. Sarah wrote about standing at her father's funeral in the rain. She wrote about watching Richard Hayes arrive at the cemetery with a team of corporate lawyers ready to seize the property before her father was even in the ground. But my father had underestimated William. Just 48 hours before his heart failed, William had managed to transfer the deed of the land into the newly finalized Hawthorne Ecological Trust. He had named Sarah as the sole anonymous beneficiary. My father was furious. He was able to seize the bank accounts and the logging equipment to satisfy the outstanding loan, but the 400 acres of prime real estate were legally locked away from him. The land was safe, but Sarah was left completely orphaned and entirely destitute. I closed the heavy leather cover of the diary. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the cold floor to steady myself. My father was a murderer in a custom-tailored suit. He had killed Sarah's father for a piece of real estate. And 20 years later, he was sitting in my living room wearing a cashmere coat, offering me $200,000 for the exact same piece of land, pretending to be my savior. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of rage. It was not the loud, chaotic anger of a sudden argument. It was a cold, silent, absolute fury that settled deep into the very marrow of my bones. Every time my mother had rolled her eyes at Sarah's thrift store clothes, every time Clayton had called her a nobody, every time my father had suggested I marry someone with a better financial pedigree. They were sitting across the dinner table from the little girl whose father they had driven into an early grave. I reached into the duffel bag one last time. There was a standard white envelope tucked into the side pocket of the bag. My name was written on the front. I opened it and pulled out a letter from Sarah. This one was dated just a few months ago, shortly after she received her terminal diagnosis. My dearest Julian. The letter began. If you have read my father's journal, you now know the absolute worst parts of my past. You know what your family did to mine. I need you to know that the day I walked into your bookstore 10 years ago was not an accident. I knew exactly who you were. I had spent years tracking the Hayes family. I hated them with every fiber of my being. I wanted to look into the eyes of Richard Hayes' son. I wanted to see the face of the family that ruined my life. But when I walked through the door of your shop, I did not find a monster. I found a man sitting on the floor behind the poetry section, crying silently into his hands. I found a man whose spirit had been completely crushed by the exact same people who crushed my father. You were not a predator, Julian. You were a victim. Your family had abused your gentle heart because you refused to care about their money. I fell in love with you that very same day. I loved you because you were the complete and total opposite of everything the Hayes family represented. I kept my identity a secret to protect you. I knew that if Richard ever found out you were married to the Hawthorne heir, he would stop at nothing to break the trust. He would use his financial leverage over your business to blackmail us. He would use his lawyers to bury us in court. I wanted our love to be entirely separate from their toxic corporate poison. I wanted us to have a quiet, simple life where the only thing that mattered was each other. But now I am gone. And I know your father. I know he will use my death as an excuse to finally destroy you. He will try to take your business. He will try to leave you with nothing. Do not let him win, Julian. The Hawthorne Ecological Trust is yours now. The land is legally yours. I leave it to you not just as a sanctuary for the forest, but as a shield. Use it to defend yourself. Use it to finally break free from the chains they have kept around your neck your entire life. I love you more than words can say. Stay strong for me. I lowered the letter. The tears I had been fighting back finally spilled over my eyelashes, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of absolute, brilliant clarity. Sarah had not just saved my life 10 years ago. She had saved my life today. She had reached beyond the grave to hand me the ultimate weapon. My motivation completely fundamentally shifted in that dark room. This was no longer just about paying a $50,000 property tax bill. This was no longer about preventing an eviction from a terrible apartment. This was not even about saving my independent bookstore. This was about justice. This was about vengeance. My father had murdered William Hawthorne for profit. He had driven my wife into a life of poverty and hiding. He had abandoned his own son to clinical depression. And now he had taken out a $100 million mezzanine loan from a Chicago equity firm, betting his entire corporate existence on the assumption that he could easily steal the Hawthorne land from a grieving, financially ruined widower. He thought he was dealing with the weak, pathetic son who always backed down. He thought he could wave a meaningless $200,000 check in my face and walk away with the keys to a billion-dollar commercial kingdom. He had absolutely no idea that I was holding the detonator to his entire life. I folded Sarah's letter and placed it carefully into my jacket pocket right next to my heart. I stood up in the dark living room. My posture was completely different. The crushing weight of the past 48 hours had evaporated. My joints no longer ached. My mind was sharper and more focused than it had been in a decade. I was going to let my father build his trap. I was going to let Clayton finalize the massive commercial zoning permits. I was going to let them stand in front of their investors and promise the world. And then at the exact moment they thought they had won, I was going to drop the guillotine on the House of Hayes. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number for Mr. Abernathy. It was time to prepare the ambush. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat on the cold linoleum floor of my freezing apartment reading William Hawthorne's diary until the gray morning sun broke through the plastic blinds. My mind was racing with a terrifying, brilliant energy. The paralyzing grief that had weighed me down since the cemetery was entirely gone, replaced by a cold and absolute determination. As soon as the clock on the kitchen wall struck 8, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number on the plain white business card Thomas Abernathy had given me. He answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him I knew everything. I told him I had spent the entire night reading the diary. I said I knew exactly what my father had done to William 20 years ago, and I knew exactly what my father was trying to do to the Hawthorne Ecological Trust right now. Abernathy went completely silent on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different. The tired, soft-spoken demeanor of a small-time probate attorney had vanished entirely. His tone was sharp, commanding, and dangerous. He told me to come to his office immediately and hung up the phone. When I arrived at the decaying strip mall on the outskirts of the city, the atmosphere inside the tiny law office had shifted completely. Abernathy was not wearing his faded tweed jacket today. He wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored black suit that made him look like a completely different human being. He locked the front glass door, pulled down the heavy vinyl blinds, and gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk. He looked me dead in the eye and confessed the absolute truth. He told me he was never a simple country probate lawyer. 30 years ago, Thomas Abernathy was one of the most ruthless and feared corporate litigators in Chicago. He had been William Hawthorne's closest friend and fiercest legal ally. When my father aggressively drove William into a fatal heart attack over a piece of real estate, Abernathy had sworn a personal oath to protect Sarah and the final 400 acres of her family legacy. He was the one who had helped a terrified 16-year-old girl structure the irrevocable trust just 48 hours before her father died. He was the one who hid her identity behind layers of corporate privacy laws so my father could never track her down. I sat back in my chair, completely stunned by the revelation. I told him that Sarah's secret was incredible, but it did not change the immediate reality of my situation. I reminded him that I was facing a physical eviction from my apartment today. My father was legally seizing my bookstore on Friday. I had a $50,000 property tax bill coming due in 30 days that I could not possibly pay. I explained that my father had offered me a pathetic $200,000 to sign the deed over to Hayes Global. I told Abernathy that my father had taken out a $100 million mezzanine loan to fund a luxury mega-development on the land, and if I did not pay the taxes, the county would seize the property and sell it to him anyway. Abernathy smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He leaned across the heavy wooden desk and told me I was missing the most important piece of the entire puzzle. He unlocked a heavy steel filing cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a thick black leather ledger. He placed it on the desk and opened it facing me. Abernathy explained that while Sarah had chosen to live a life of absolute poverty to stay hidden from the world, the Hawthorne Ecological Trust was not just holding a piece of restricted forest land. The trust also contained a quiet, highly guarded investment portfolio. When William Hawthorne died, Abernathy had quietly liquidated all the remaining logging equipment, the family vehicles, and the secondary commercial properties. He had placed the proceeds into high-yield, anonymous corporate accounts. That money had been sitting untouched, compounding interest quietly for 2 entire decades. The trust did not just hold land. The trust had tens of millions of dollars in highly liquid capital. The air in the office vanished from my lungs. I asked him why Sarah never touched a single dime of that money while we were struggling to buy groceries. Abernathy told me that Sarah adamantly refused to use what she considered blood money to fund her personal life. She wanted to live simply and honestly. But she had authorized Abernathy to manage the trust capital for one specific highly secretive purpose: defense. Over the past 5 years, as my father began his aggressive lobbying campaign to rezone the land and hike the property taxes, Abernathy had been quietly using the trust funds to fight back. He had been using anonymous shell companies to buy up pieces of Hayes Global's secondary corporate debt. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was saying. I brought up the massive mezzanine loan again. I told Abernathy that Hayes Global owed $100 million to a ruthless private equity firm in Chicago, and that the loan matured in exactly 30 days. Abernathy let out a low, satisfied laugh. He closed the black leather ledger and looked directly into my eyes. He told me he knew exactly who held that massive corporate debt. He knew because he was the one who had quietly negotiated the purchase of that exact mezzanine loan portfolio on behalf of the Hawthorne Trust just 3 weeks ago. My father did not owe $100 million to a faceless private equity firm in Chicago. Through a complex web of legal holding companies, Richard Hayes owed that money directly to the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. He owed it directly to me. The shock hit me so hard I had to grip the armrests of my chair to keep from falling forward. I was no longer a helpless, grieving victim. I was my father's primary secured creditor. Abernathy explained the brutal legal reality of our position. Mezzanine loans were secured by the equity of the borrowing company itself. As the newly appointed sole executor of the trust, I had the absolute legal authority to demand immediate repayment in full the exact second the loan matured. My father was relying entirely on acquiring the Hawthorne land this week so he could secure his final zoning permits. Those permits would trigger a massive wave of secondary investor funding, which he planned to use to pay off the mezzanine debt. If I refused to sell the land, the zoning permits would automatically fail. If the zoning permits failed, his secondary investors would pull out. He would have absolutely zero cash to pay the $100 million loan. And because he had put up his entire corporate empire as collateral, I would have the legal right to instantly seize Hayes Global in its entirety and liquidate every single building he owned. We spent the next 4 hours sitting in that dusty office, drinking black coffee and structuring the most lethal legal maneuver of my entire life. We drafted the formal notices of default. We prepared the asset seizure documentation. We built a legal bear trap so perfectly designed that my father would never even feel the steel jaws closing around his neck. But I needed to make absolutely sure that my father and my brother did not suspect a single thing until it was far too late. I needed them to stand in front of their wealthy investors and confidently bet their entire existence on this acquisition. I needed to feed their massive egos until they choked on them. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed my brother's private number. I took a deep breath, pushing down the burning rage inside my chest, and forced my voice to sound completely broken. Clayton answered the phone with a loud, highly irritated sigh. He asked if I had finally come to my senses, or if I was calling to cry about my eviction notice again. I poured every ounce of my recent grief and exhaustion into my performance. I sounded defeated, pathetic, and completely desperate. I told Clayton that I was sitting on the floor of my freezing apartment. I told him the sheriff had just posted the final lockout warning on my door. I made my voice shake. I told him I was terrified that I had no money for food and that I simply could not fight against the family anymore. I said I was ready to surrender. I told him I would sign the purchase agreement. I would give them the 400 acres of useless swampland for the $200,000. Clayton let out a sharp hissing breath of absolute victory. I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. He told me I was finally acting like a rational adult. He ordered me to bring the paperwork to his downtown legal office immediately so we could finalize the transfer and get me out of his hair. I hesitated perfectly. I let a long, pathetic silence hang on the line. Then I told him I had one single condition before I signed my name on the deed. I knew from my research at the municipal building that Hayes Global was hosting a massive, highly publicized press conference on Friday morning. They were planning to officially announce the billion-dollar luxury commercial hub to their top-tier investors, the city council and the local real estate media. I told Clayton I wanted to sign the land contract right there in public at the press conference. I played the psychological card that I knew his monumental arrogance could never resist. I told him that I had spent my entire life feeling like a massive disappointment. I said I just wanted my father to look at me in front of his wealthy peers and finally acknowledge that I had done something right for the family empire. I begged him, my voice cracking with fake emotion, to let me stand on that stage and be brought back into the family fold. I said I wanted to hand the deed directly to Dad so he would finally be proud of me. The silence on the line was incredibly thick. For a second, I worried I had pushed the act too far. But then Clayton laughed. It was a dark, deeply satisfied, incredibly cruel chuckle. He bought the act completely. He and my father had spent 30 years deliberately breaking my spirit and telling me I was worthless. It made perfect logical sense to them that after losing my wife, my home, and my business, I would finally crawl back on my hands and knees begging for a tiny scrap of public validation from the men who ruined me. Clayton eagerly agreed to my condition. He told me to find a decent suit that did not smell like a thrift store and to bring a black pen. He promised me that if I handed over the deed on that stage, my father would finally give me the public approval I was crying like a baby for. He told me not to be late, and he hung up the phone. I lowered the device and looked across the heavy wooden desk at Thomas Abernathy. The retired corporate shark was leaning back in his chair, a look of profound respect etched into his weathered features. We both knew exactly what was going to happen on Friday morning. Clayton and Richard were entirely blinded by their own supreme arrogance. They thought they had successfully crushed a weak, grieving widower. They were going to spend the next 48 hours chilling the expensive champagne for their massive corporate victory. They were going to stand in front of the flashing cameras and the billionaires of the city completely certain that they had finally conquered the world. They had absolutely no idea they were happily walking straight into a meticulously planned ambush. They were inviting me onto their stage to surrender entirely unaware that the nobody they had discarded was walking into their boardroom with a loaded weapon ready to burn their billion-dollar legacy completely to ashes. The glass doors of the Hayes Global corporate headquarters slid open with a quiet, expensive hiss. I stepped into the massive lobby, the polished marble floors reflecting the bright morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The air inside smelled of fresh espresso, expensive floral arrangements, and absolute power. I was wearing the only dark suit I owned. It was the same worn, slightly faded suit I had worn to bury my wife in the freezing rain just days earlier. My shoes were clean but visibly scuffed. I did not belong in a building like this, and every single security guard and receptionist in the lobby knew it just by looking at me. But I walked toward the private executive elevators with my head held completely high. Inside my simple leather briefcase rested the combined weight of 2 decades of vengeance. I rode the elevator up to the top floor in total silence. When the silver doors parted, I stepped into an atmosphere of absolute celebration. The entire executive suite had been transformed for a massive press event. Waiters in crisp white shirts were circulating through the crowd, carrying silver trays lined with crystal flutes of imported champagne. The room was packed with the most powerful people in the city. There were local politicians, wealthy private investors, and members of the real estate press. In the center of the room, standing proudly next to a massive, highly detailed architectural scale model of their billion-dollar commercial hub, was my family. My father, Richard, was holding court. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, laughing loudly at a joke told by the city zoning commissioner. My mother, Beatrice, stood by his side, draped in designer silk and flashing her brilliant, perfectly practiced smile to the cameras. Clayton was aggressively shaking hands with a group of out-of-state investors, projecting the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. They were celebrating the creation of a commercial empire that was going to be built directly over the grave of William Hawthorne. They were popping champagne over a victory they thought they had secured by robbing a grieving widower. Clayton was the first one to spot me. His eyes darted over the crowd and locked onto my worn suit. A smug, deeply satisfied smirk spread across his face. He leaned over and whispered something into my father's ear. Richard turned, saw me standing near the elevator, and his entire face lit up with a sickeningly fake expression of paternal warmth. My father excused himself from the city politicians and walked across the crowded room toward me. He threw his arms open wide and pulled me into a tight embrace right in front of the flashing cameras of the local press. He patted my back heavily, playing the role of the benevolent, loving patriarch saving his lost son. He leaned in close to my ear, his voice dropping into a low, completely commanding whisper, meant only for me. "You made the right choice, Julian." My father whispered, his grip on my shoulder tightening just enough to hurt. "You are finally acting like a man. Do not embarrass me in front of these people. Smile, sign the paper, and you can take your little check and go back to your pathetic life." He pulled away, beaming broadly for the cameras, and guided me by the arm toward the massive glass-enclosed boardroom at the far end of the executive suite. Clayton and my mother immediately broke away from their conversations and followed us. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom were closed behind us, instantly cutting off the noise of the crowded press event. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere changed immediately. The fake, loving smiles dropped from their faces the exact second the doors locked. The cameras were gone, so they no longer had to pretend that I was a human being. I was just a minor legal hurdle standing between them and their billion-dollar payday. There were a few incredibly wealthy private investors sitting at the far end of the massive mahogany table reviewing financial portfolios. My father ignored them and directed me to a leather chair directly across from him. My mother sat to his left, crossing her arms and looking out the window, completely bored by my presence. Clayton stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out with total superiority. Clayton unlatched his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out the crisp, legally binding purchase agreement. He slid it across the smooth wooden table. The paper stopped right in front of my hands. "Here it is, Julian," Clayton said, tapping the document with his silver pen. $200,000 in cash for a piece of useless swampland. Dad is also officially waiving the penalty clause on your bookstore lease. You are entirely off the hook. Just sign your name on the bottom line and we can go back out there and announce the final land acquisition to the press. I looked down at the contract. The words were printed in sharp black ink. It was the exact same piece of paper they had tried to force on me in my freezing dark apartment. It was the ultimate insult. They truly believed I was stupid enough to sign away a $40 million piece of real estate for absolute pennies. I looked up at my father. He was staring at me with cold, calculating eyes. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the weak, depressed son to simply fold under the pressure of his monumental corporate presence. I read the document you left at my apartment. I said, my voice completely calm and steady. I noticed that the contract requires me to sign over the land completely free of any environmental restrictions. My father let out a short, dismissive sigh. That is standard legal boilerplate, Julian. It means absolutely nothing to you. The city will handle the rezoning. Your only job today is to sign your name and take my money so you do not end up sleeping in a cardboard box by Monday morning. But the land belongs to the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. I continued, keeping my tone perfectly measured. Sarah's father created that trust specifically so the land could never be commercially developed. If I sign this over to Hayes Global, you are going to bulldoze 400 acres of old-growth forest to build a shopping mall. My mother finally turned her head away from the window. She glared at me, her eyes filled with absolute venom. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Julian!" Beatrice snapped, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet boardroom. "Stop being so terribly dramatic. Your wife is dead. Her father is dead. Nobody cares about a bunch of dirt and trees. We are trying to build the future of this city, and we are paying you an incredibly generous amount of money to get out of our way. Stop wasting our time and sign the document." "My wife cared," I said, looking directly into my mother's eyes. "My wife cared deeply about that land. She cared about the legacy her father tried to protect before your husband harassed him into an early grave." The entire room went completely dead silent. The wealthy private investors sitting at the far end of the table stopped shuffling their papers. They looked up suddenly, highly interested in the conversation. Clayton's smug smile vanished entirely. My father's posture shifted. He sat up completely straight, his eyes narrowing into dark, dangerous slits. "What did you just say?" my father demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, threatening register. "I read William Hawthorne's personal diary," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the mahogany table. "I know exactly what you did 20 years ago, Dad. I know about the predatory loan. I know about the balloon payment. I know you deliberately strangled his cash flow until the stress stopped his heart. You killed Sarah's father for a piece of real estate." My father's face turned a violent, alarming shade of purple. He slammed his hand flat against the heavy wooden table. "You listen to me, you pathetic little failure," my father hissed, completely losing his carefully crafted public temper. "William Hawthorne was a weak old fool who could not handle basic business mechanics. I did not kill anyone. I simply outplayed him. And now I am outplaying you. You are completely bankrupt. You are being evicted. I own the lease to your failing bookstore. You have absolutely no leverage in this room. You are going to pick up that pen, you are going to sign the deed over to my company, and you are going to walk out of this building before I have my security team throw you into the street." Clayton took a threatening step toward me. He looked like he wanted to physically force the silver pen into my hand. "Sign the paper, Julian," Clayton commanded, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "You are completely out of your depth. You have no idea what you are messing with." "You are right, Clayton," I said softly. I had no idea what I was messing with, but then I sat down with Thomas Abernathy. The color completely drained out of my father's face the exact second that name left my lips. Richard Hayes knew exactly who Thomas Abernathy was. He knew Abernathy was the ruthless legal architect who had successfully hidden the Hawthorne land from Hayes Global for 20 entire years. I slowly reached into my simple leather briefcase. I bypassed the silver pen resting on the table. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy black folder bearing the official red wax seal of the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. I placed it directly on top of the $200,000 purchase agreement my father had tried to force me to sign. "I am not signing your contract," I announced, my voice projecting clearly across the room so the private investors could hear every single syllable. "I am the sole legal executor of the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. I am officially denying your request to purchase the land. The 400 acres will remain an environmentally protected sanctuary in perpetuity. Your commercial zoning permits are officially dead." Chaos erupted in the boardroom. The private investors at the end of the table immediately stood up, their faces pale with panic. They knew that without the land, the entire billion-dollar development project was completely fraudulent. Clayton grabbed the edge of the table, looking like he was about to have a heart attack. "You cannot do this, Julian. Do you understand what you are doing? If we do not acquire that land today, the city will revoke the permits. If the permits are revoked, the primary funding collapses. You are going to bankrupt the entire company." "I am perfectly aware of your financial situation, Clayton," I said, a cold smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. "I know that Hayes Global took out a $100 million mezzanine loan from a private equity firm in Chicago to fund this entire operation. I know that Dad put up his entire corporate real estate portfolio as collateral to secure that cash." My father stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between me and the private investors who were now rapidly whispering into their cell phones. "How do you know about the mezzanine loan?" my father demanded, his voice shaking with genuine, unfiltered fear. "That loan is strictly confidential corporate information. You have no access to those files." "I know about the loan because I read the fine print," I replied, opening the thick black folder and pulling out a heavy stack of complex financial transfer documents. "But more importantly, I know about the loan because you no longer owe that money to an equity firm in Chicago." I slid the stack of legally binding documents across the table. They stopped directly in front of my father's trembling hands. "Thomas Abernathy is an incredibly thorough attorney," I explained, my voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final sentence. "When Sarah's father died, Abernathy liquidated the remaining estate assets and placed the cash into anonymous high-yield corporate accounts. That money has been compounding interest for 20 years. The Hawthorne Ecological Trust is incredibly wealthy, Dad, and Abernathy has been using that wealth to quietly buy up distressed corporate debt." My father looked down at the papers. His eyes scanned the bold black text. I watched his entire world shatter in real time. "3 weeks ago, through a blind shell company, the Hawthorne Ecological Trust purchased your $100 million mezzanine loan from the Chicago firm," I said, locking my eyes with his. "You do not owe them anymore. You owe me." My mother let out a small, terrified gasp. She covered her mouth with her hands, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. Clayton stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall of the boardroom, his perfect corporate composure completely destroyed. "You legally bet your entire company on the assumption that you could steal my land from me," I told my father, my voice thick with absolute venom. "You put up every single building you own as collateral. And according to the original terms of that loan, which I now fully control, the debt reaches full maturity today." I reached into the folder and pulled out one final document. It was a formal, legally certified notice of default. I slid it across the table until it rested directly over his fake, meaningless purchase agreement. "I am not just refusing to sell you the land," I said, standing up from my chair and looking down at the men who had tormented me for my entire life. "As the legal executor of the Hawthorne Trust, I am officially calling in the $100 million debt. The money is due in full immediately, and since I know for a fact that you do not have the liquid cash to pay me, I am invoking the collateral clause." I pointed to the document. "I am seizing Hayes Global. I am taking your buildings. I am taking your company. I am tearing your entire billion-dollar empire completely down to the dirt." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that only exists in the exact moment before a massive explosion. The three private investors sitting at the far end of the mahogany table had been completely still when I threw the notice of default onto the wood. Now they were moving with frantic, terrified energy. These were men who controlled billions of dollars in commercial real estate. They knew the smell of a dying company. One of the lead investors, a tall man with silver hair, reached across the table and snatched up the financial transfer documents I had provided. His eyes darted rapidly across the thick black text. I watched his face drain of all color. He looked from the paper to my father and then back to the paper. The investor slammed the documents down onto the table with a sound like a gunshot. He demanded to know if this was a joke. He asked my father if Hayes Global had really hidden a $100 million mezzanine loan from the primary stakeholders. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His jaw worked silently up and down. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the trap he had just stepped into. The silver-haired investor did not wait for an excuse. He turned to his colleagues and told them to pack their briefcases immediately. He announced to the entire room that Hayes Global was completely insolvent. He stated clearly that my father had deliberately falsified corporate financial disclosures by hiding the maturity date of the mezzanine debt. The investors knew that if the debt was called in today, my father would have absolutely zero liquid capital to pay it. Hayes Global was effectively bankrupt in that very room. The investors stood up in unison. The noise of their leather chairs scraping against the polished floor felt like beautiful music to my ears. My father reached his hands out across the table, begging them to wait. He promised them he could fix this entire situation. He swore he could leverage his other commercial properties to cover the sudden default. But the investors simply ignored him. They looked at my father with the exact same disgust he had always shown to the poor and vulnerable people of this city. They recognized a sinking ship, and they were severing all ties before they were dragged down to the bottom of the ocean with him. The silver-haired investor looked back at me with a nod of profound professional respect. He saw exactly what I had done. He saw a man who had perfectly executed a flawless corporate execution on behalf of a wronged family. Without another word, the three wealthiest men in the room turned their backs on Richard Hayes and walked straight out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them, sealing my family inside the tomb of their own making. Clayton was breathing so rapidly I thought he might actually collapse. His perfect corporate composure had completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He stared at the empty chairs where the investors had just been sitting. His entire professional identity was tied to the success of this billion-dollar luxury commercial hub. He was the lead acquisitions attorney. He was the man responsible for verifying the land titles and securing the legal pathways for the zoning permits. He turned his panicked eyes toward me. His face was slick with a cold sweat. His expensive, custom-tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his shrinking frame. He walked toward my side of the table, holding his hands up in a gesture of desperate surrender. He completely forgot the arrogant insults he had thrown at me yesterday when he showed up to steal my bookstore. Clayton asked me to listen to reason. He begged me to understand the legal ramifications of what I was doing. I remained seated, completely still and perfectly calm. I watched my older brother unravel right in front of my eyes. I told Clayton that he was the one who failed to understand the legal ramifications. I reminded him that he was the attorney of record for the shell company attempting to steal the land. I spoke loudly and clearly so every single word would echo off the glass walls. I pointed out that Clayton had formally guaranteed a clear and unencumbered land title to the city zoning commission. He had legally certified that Hayes Global could acquire the Hawthorne Trust property. But Clayton had failed to do his fundamental due diligence. He had completely failed to uncover the irrevocable ecological restrictions tied to the 400 acres. He had failed to realize that the anonymous executor of the trust had weaponized their own capital to purchase his company debt. I looked my brother directly in the eyes and told him his career was permanently over. When the City Council and the State Bar Association discovered that he had built a $1 billion zoning petition on a foundation of absolute fraud, he would be completely ruined. I told him he would be disbarred for gross professional malpractice. No legitimate law firm in the entire country would ever hire a corporate attorney who accidentally allowed his own family empire to be legally swallowed whole by a single unknown trust fund. Clayton fell to his knees next to the mahogany table. The man who had mocked my dead wife and threatened to leave me homeless was now kneeling on the floor of his dying company. He begged me to renegotiate the terms of the loan. He offered me a seat on the board of directors. He promised me millions of dollars in corporate shares if I would just give them an extension on the mezzanine debt. I looked down at him with absolute pity. I told him that his corporate shares were currently worth absolutely nothing. I told him he had nothing left to offer me. The sound of Clayton begging finally snapped my father out of his paralyzed state. Richard Hayes realized that his life work, his massive real estate portfolio, his towering glass skyscrapers, and his immense personal wealth were all evaporating into thin air. His face shifted from pure terror to a dark, violent rage. The purple color returned to his cheeks. The veins on his thick neck bulged visibly against his crisp white collar. He lunged across the large wooden table, sending the fake $200,000 purchase agreement flying onto the floor. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. He screamed that I was an ungrateful parasite. He shouted that he was the man who gave me life, and he could easily take it away. He threatened to hire the most ruthless litigation teams in the state to tie the Hawthorne Ecological Trust up in probate court for the next 30 years. He swore he would bleed me dry with legal fees until I was forced to live on the streets. He demanded that I surrender the notice of default immediately, or he would personally see to it that I never found peace in this city again. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply sat in my chair and watched the great and powerful Richard Hayes throw a pathetic, meaningless tantrum. When he finally ran out of breath, I stood up slowly. I picked up the heavy black folder containing the legal seizure documents. I looked my father dead in the eye and let the cold, absolute reality of his situation sink into his bones. I told him that he had no money left to hire a litigation team. I reminded him that his corporate bank accounts would be frozen by the end of the business day. The private equity firm in Chicago had officially transferred the full rights of the mezzanine loan to me. I now held the legal right to liquidate his assets to recover the $100 million he owed my trust. I told my father that he could not bully me the way he had bullied William Hawthorne 20 years ago. I said the name William Hawthorne very slowly, letting the syllables hang heavily in the tense air of the boardroom. My father stepped backward as if he had been physically struck. His eyes widened in sheer horror. I told him that Sarah knew exactly what he did. I told him that I had read the diary. I promised my father that every single building he had stolen, every piece of land he had corrupted, and every dollar he had hoarded would be stripped away from him. He was going to spend the rest of his miserable life fighting the Internal Revenue Service and bankruptcy courts. He was going to lose the gated mansion. He was going to lose his luxury cars. He was going to experience the exact same suffocating, helpless poverty that he had forced onto Sarah and her father. Richard tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He backed away from the table, his hands shaking wildly. The realization that he had been destroyed by the very son he considered a massive failure finally broke him. He collapsed into his leather executive chair, burying his face in his hands, a broken, defeated old man. Then came the most pathetic moment of the entire morning. My mother Beatrice had been standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, completely silent for the entire confrontation. She had watched her wealthy investors flee. She had watched her golden child, Clayton, fall to his knees. She had watched her husband completely surrender. Beatrice realized that her life of endless luxury charity galas and country club dinners was officially over. She was about to be the wife of a bankrupt, disgraced fraud. She suddenly rushed forward. Her expensive designer heels clicked frantically across the polished floor. She shoved Clayton out of the way and threw herself across the mahogany table toward me. Tears were streaming down her perfectly manicured face. The cold, calculating woman who had treated me like absolute garbage my entire life was suddenly putting on the performance of a lifetime. She reached out and grabbed my hands. Her grip was desperate and tight. She sobbed loudly, begging me to stop this madness. She told me that I was a good boy. She told me that I had a kind and gentle heart, just like my beautiful wife, Sarah. Hearing her say the name of my wife made my stomach turn with pure disgust. Beatrice pleaded with me to remember the past. She said we were a family. She cried that family members do not destroy each other over money. She begged me to tear up the notice of default. She promised we could start over completely fresh. She swore that she and Dad would buy me a new bookstore. She promised they would help me honor the memory of Sarah by donating to her women's shelter. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, using every single ounce of emotional manipulation she possessed. I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no love left in my heart for these people. They had completely burned the bridge of our relationship when they decided my grief was less important than their corporate greed. I slowly pulled my hands out of her desperate grip. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the crisp paper of the final letter my wife had written resting against my chest. It gave me the ultimate strength to deliver the final blow. I looked at my mother while she continued to weep fake tears over her lost fortune. I kept my voice incredibly calm, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. I looked at her and echoed the exact same words she had used to dismiss my dead wife just a few short days ago. I told her I would love to help her, but I explained that I was currently closing a major deal and her complete financial bankruptcy was just a trivial inconvenience to me. My mother froze. The fake tears completely stopped. Her mouth opened in shock as she recognized her own cruel words being turned into a lethal weapon against her. She let out a small, wounded gasp and sank back into her chair. I turned my back on my parents and my brother. I picked up my simple leather briefcase containing the future of the Hawthorne Ecological Trust. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Clayton was still sobbing on the floor. My father was staring blankly at the wall. My mother was weeping into her designer handbag. I pushed the glass door open and walked out into the bright morning sunlight pouring through the executive lobby. I did not look back a single time. I left them sitting right there, completely buried in the ashes of their own ruined empire. The sunlight hitting my face as I walked out of the Hayes Global Headquarters felt completely different than the sunlight I had known my entire life. It was no longer a cold light illuminating my failures. It was warm and absolute. I stood on the concrete sidewalk surrounded by the towering glass monuments of corporate greed and took a massive breath of fresh air. For 38 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family and their impossible expectations. I had let them convince me that I was a defective human being because I did not want to spend my life destroying others for profit. I had let them make me feel small. But as I stood there holding my simple leather briefcase, I realized that being small was the greatest strength a person could possess. It was the small people who slipped through the cracks. It was the small people who held the rusted keys that brought the giants to their knees. 6 months have passed since the morning I dropped that notice of default onto the mahogany boardroom table. The aftermath was swift and incredibly brutal. The collapse of Hayes Global was not a quiet corporate restructuring. It was a spectacular public execution. When the private investors pulled their funding, the company instantly defaulted on the $100 million mezzanine loan. Because my father had leveraged his entire empire as collateral, I was legally empowered to seize absolutely everything. Thomas Abernathy moved with the ruthless precision of a great white shark. He froze my father out of his own bank accounts before the lunch hour was over. He filed the asset seizure documents with the county court, blocking Richard Hayes from liquidating or hiding a single dime. My father spent his entire life bullying desperate people with predatory contracts. When he finally found himself on the receiving end of an airtight legal trap, he completely folded. He tried to fight us in court, but he had no money to pay his defense attorneys. The corporate empire he had spent 4 decades building was dismantled brick by brick in less than 90 days. The commercial buildings were sold at auction. The luxury holding companies were liquidated. Today, Richard and Beatrice Hayes no longer live in a fortress behind iron gates. They lost the mansion. They lost the country club memberships. They lost the imported luxury cars. They are currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom rented condo on the very edge of the city. But the loss of their wealth was only the beginning of their punishment. During the intense forensic accounting required by the bankruptcy courts, the federal government discovered decades of highly illegal tax evasion practices buried deep inside the Hayes global ledgers. My parents are currently facing a massive federal audit by the Internal Revenue Service. They spend their days sitting in a tiny living room answering calls from aggressive collection agencies. They are living the exact nightmare of crushing poverty and helpless stress that my father purposely inflicted upon William Hawthorne 20 years ago. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales. My mother tried to call me a dozen times during the first few weeks of their collapse. She left frantic, tearful voicemails begging me to help them. She reminded me over and over again that she gave birth to me. I never answered the phone. I never returned a single message. I let her voice echo into the void. She had called my dead wife a trivial inconvenience while I stood freezing at her grave. She had made her choice entirely clear. I simply honored her request to sever our relationship. I changed my phone number and erased her from my existence. Clayton faced a much more public humiliation. The city council was absolutely furious when they learned the billion-dollar commercial zoning petition was built on fundamentally fraudulent legal grounds. The investors who had lost their initial deposits demanded blood. They filed massive malpractice lawsuits directly against my brother. The State Bar Association launched an immediate ethics investigation into his failure to clear the Hawthorne land title. Clayton was completely disbarred. His license to practice law was permanently revoked. The golden child, the brilliant corporate prodigy who had mocked me for being a poor bookstore owner, is now completely unemployable in the legal field. He recently took a job selling used cars just to make his monthly child support payments. He can no longer afford his tailored suits or his designer watches. He looks exactly like the miserable, broken nobody he had accused me of being. As for the 400 acres of pristine, untouched forest, I did not build the commercial hub. I never had any intention of becoming a real estate developer. That land was Sarah and her father. It was the physical manifestation of their gentle spirits. I worked closely with Thomas Abernathy to use a large portion of the liquidated corporate funds to establish a permanent ironclad legal trust. We renamed the property the Sarah Hawthorne Wildlife Sanctuary. We established an endowment that pays the county property taxes in perpetuity. We worked with environmental protection agencies to ensure that the 400 acres can never be touched by a bulldozer, a chainsaw, or a corporate developer for the rest of human history. The forest is completely safe. The rivers will continue to run clear. The ancient oak trees will continue to stand tall, protecting the quiet creatures of the woods. I visit the sanctuary every single Sunday morning. I walk along the dirt trails, listening to the wind rustle through the heavy green leaves. It is the most peaceful place on earth. When I stand beneath the massive canopy of those ancient trees, I can feel Sarah right there with me. I can feel her warmth in the sunlight filtering through the branches. I know she is watching over me. I know she is smiling because we finally secured the victory her father had sacrificed his life to achieve. We defeated the monsters who feed on the weak. The remaining liquid capital from the original Hawthorne Trust was more than enough to completely alter my personal reality. I did not buy a mansion. I did not buy an expensive sports car. I had seen firsthand what toxic wealth does to the human soul, and I refused to let that poison infect my life. Instead, I used the money to pay off the massive mountain of medical debt hanging over my head. I cleared the hospital bills. I paid off the credit cards. I finally wiped the financial slate entirely clean. Then I went back to the one place in the city that felt like home. I paid my former landlord completely in cash, purchasing the physical building that housed my independent bookstore. I took the master lease that my father had weaponized against me, and I shredded it into tiny pieces. I completely renovated the shop. I installed new hardwood floors, put in massive reading chairs, and expanded the poetry section that Sarah had loved so deeply. I hired extra staff and started hosting weekend reading events for the local community. The bookstore is now entirely debt-free and thriving beyond my wildest dreams. It is filled with light and laughter and the comforting smell of roasted coffee and old paper. It is a place of healing. It is a place where people can come in from the cold city streets and find a moment of quiet peace. Every evening before I lock the front door of the shop, I walk over to a small glass display case near the cash register. Sitting on a black velvet cushion inside the glass is the rusted safety deposit box key. I keep it there as a constant daily reminder of the absolute darkest week of my life. When I look at that chipped brown metal, I think about the profound difference between my family and the woman I married. My parents and my brother spent their entire lives chasing paper. They worshipped numbers on a screen. They believed that power came from wearing expensive suits, driving luxury vehicles, and stepping on the throats of anyone they viewed as small or insignificant. They built an empire on arrogance and cruelty. They thought their money made them invincible gods. But Sarah chose a completely different path. She was born into wealth, and she willingly walked away from it because she understood that money without morality is just a shiny disease. She chose to be small. She chose to work for minimum wage at a shelter, helping broken women find a warm bed. She chose to love a severely depressed bookstore owner who had absolutely nothing to offer her but his heart. She lived quietly. She loved deeply. She asked for nothing from the world. And in doing so, she held the ultimate power. She held the legal key that brought a corrupt billion-dollar empire crashing down to the dirt. She defeated the mighty Richard Hayes without ever raising her voice. She taught me that true wealth is not measured by the commercial properties you develop or the corporate titles you hold. True wealth is the character you build when nobody is watching. It is the integrity you maintain when the world tries to crush you. It is the people you love and the innocent things you protect. My family laughed at me for burying a shelter worker. They called my grief a trivial inconvenience. They mocked me for inheriting a piece of literal rust. They were absolutely certain that I was a pathetic loser who would just roll over and die. But they failed to realize that when you strip everything away from a man, when you take his wife, his home, and his livelihood, you leave him with absolutely nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on the face of the earth. I lost the love of my life to a terrible illness, but her spirit lives on in every single leaf of the sanctuary forest and every single book on my shelves. I am no longer the weak, depressed boy my father kicked to the curb. I am a man who stood his ground and fought back against the darkness. I am the man who destroyed the vultures. I am the guardian of the Hawthorne legacy. Have you ever had a family member value money over your own grief? How did you handle it? Drop a comment below. Share this story if you believe karma always collects its debts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the hidden truths of family.